Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that, honestly, can feel a little overwhelming at times, but it is absolutely crucial: the counseling process. Specifically, we're looking at Module 11 of BC 101 from the Restoring Hope School of Biblical Counseling. We are going to completely demystify this whole journey. We'll see how putting a clear structure in place isn't about being rigid at all. It actually provides a deeply compassionate framework for helping whole persons before God. We've got some fantastic material to get through, so let's jump right in.
Okay, let's dive into this right away with a question I really want you to ask yourself. Do you personally prefer unstructured warmth, because goals just feel controlling? Or do you lean toward a rigid structure because uncertainty feels threatening? Be totally honest with yourself here. It's okay. This question immediately centers our own personal biases about care. Understanding whether you naturally lean toward avoiding goals or hiding behind rigid rules is going to profoundly shape your attention, your pace, and how you hold power in a helping conversation.
And that brings us to the central thesis of this entire module. A counseling process gives compassionate structure to care through informed consent, shared goals, careful assessment, scripture-shaped interpretation, concrete practice, review, and appropriate ending. I absolutely love this because it completely reorients how we view the rules of counseling, right? Structure is not some bureaucratic hurdle. It's not red tape. It is actually a deeply necessary framework for compassionate care. Without it, we aren't truly caring for the person sitting right in front of us.
So, to break this down, we'll follow this chronological journey through a counseling relationship, from the very first agreement to the final goodbye. Our agenda covers 5 parts: structure as compassionate care, informed consent foundations, the flexible session arc, shared goals and practice, and finally, review and appropriate ending.
Let's start with part 1, structure as compassionate care.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it frames the foundation of the counseling process. We have to remember that Scripture addresses whole persons before God. We are not just isolated decision-making machines. This whole-person analysis grid captures that exact complexity perfectly. Look at the domains down the side: events, body, thoughts, emotions, actions, relationships. A person might experience a crisis through a totally unique combination of their physical body, their history, their culture, and their habits. By breaking our analysis down into known data, possible meanings, and unknowns, well, it proves that our process is highly analytical, but at the same time, completely holistic. We have to gather the data before we jump to any sort of interpretation.
This kind of analytical patience applies directly to how we use Scripture too. It's a 4-step movement: observation, interpretation, canonical synthesis, and fitting application. The module warns us pretty strongly here. Do not begin by just searching for a counseling slogan to slap onto a problem like a Band-Aid. Actually, scratch that. It's worse than a Band-Aid. First, you have to determine what the text actually says and does. Jumping straight to application without observation is a major practical error that honestly misuses the text and damages the relationship with the person you're trying to help.
Moving right along to part 2. Informed consent foundations.
So, we are now in the before phase of counseling. Before any deep work begins, we need informed consent. That's a voluntary, informed agreement to a role, process, recording, disclosure, or intervention with a meaningful ability to ask and refuse. I really want to highlight that last part, the ability to ask and refuse. A massive practical error we see in counseling is treating consent merely as a piece of paper signed in a waiting room. The correct, biblical concept is an ongoing conversation. It makes love accountable by keeping everything completely transparent.
So, what actually makes up that ongoing conversation? Well, we're talking about clearly defining your role and limitations, confidentiality limits, records, supervision, technology, fees, emergency limitations, and the freedom to ask questions. Consent doesn't just happen once at the start. It continues throughout care whenever topics, methods, or collaboration change. This is absolutely crucial because it protects both the person seeking help and the counselor.
That brings us to part 3, the flexible session arc.
Now we are entering the during phase of counseling. You might be wondering, how do you actually manage a standard 50-minute session without it just devolving into aimless chatting? The answer is the session arc. It's a flexible sequence of responsibilities that helps a counselor hold complexity and remember what simply must not be omitted. If you don't have an arc, you're going to fall into some big practical errors. An agendaless meeting might be full of warmth, sure, but it completely silences what is truly urgent. On the flip side, an overly rigid meeting lacks theological direction and just feels like a clinical checklist. The arc is the sweet spot.
Let's move to and see how this builds across the hour. You start with a welcome and check safety.
review the prior week, and agree on a focus. Then you explore the story, offer a provisional formulation, bring scripture and hope, practice a response, summarize the plan, and finally document the whole shebang. Look at how these elements perfectly provide a reliable container for complex human suffering. It ensures nothing vital gets lost in the emotional intensity of the room.
All right, on to part 4, shared goals and practice.
Once we have our session structure locked in, we need to shift from just gaining insight to taking collaborative action. And this brilliantly illustrates the point with a fictional case study. Say, after 6 meetings, a student helper and counselee just keep discussing the exact same conflict without agreed goals or any review. The counselee says the meetings feel supportive, sure, but they have no idea what they're actually working toward. These are the real-world stakes right here. Support without direction becomes stagnation. Without agreed-upon goals, you aren't really doing counseling. You're just having a recurring, pleasant conversation that ultimately leaves the person stuck in their suffering.
So what does a valid goal actually look like? It's a collaborative, revisable target describing meaningful change and observable practices without promising outcomes controlled by other people. I really want you to lock onto that last phrase. A huge theological and practical error is the counselor trying to play God. Trying to control or fix the person, or promising that someone else in their life will definitely change. Goals absolutely must be specific, proportionate to what is known, and entirely respectful of the individual's own agency.
This applies directly to how we handle home practices, or what we often dreadfully call homework. The text gives us a stark warning here. Homework can support practice, or it can communicate that the person failed to earn care. What a profound contrast! If a counselor uses assignments rigidly, they can accidentally signal to a hurting person that they didn't earn love or care that week simply because they didn't complete a worksheet. Concrete home practices have to be proportionate and preserve the person's agency at all times. It's a real game changer when you get this right.
And finally, part 5, review and appropriate ending. We've finally reached the after phase. Termination, or ending, is the necessary phase of care that reviews growth, limits, relapse risks, and next steps, rather than simply stopping contact. Long-term dependency grows when endings remain undefined. And conversely, simply ghosting someone or cutting off contact abruptly, that is a deeply harmful error. A structured ending is, in itself, a profound act of compassion. So, the crucial point is how we actually execute this ending. The tasks include reviewing growth and grace, acknowledging limits, identifying relapse risks, establishing community supports, and outlining next steps. Notice acknowledging limits in there. The source text states beautifully that creaturely limitation is not a defect to conceal, but a condition within which wisdom, collaboration, and prayer become completely necessary. We have to acknowledge our limits as counselors and actively help people lean into their community.
To wrap this up, I want to leave you with a closing integration prompt taken directly from the module. Fill in these blanks in your own mind right now. Because God is blank, and because persons are blank, faithful care should blank while refusing to blank. Synthesizing this entire process ultimately comes down to who God is and who we are before Him. Take this structured compassion and use it to craft your next wise, humble act of love. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.